Okay, so this week we're hosting sessions by organisations who took part in the Catalyst Sector Challenge programme, which was funded by the National Lottery Community Fund. And these projects were a collaborative effort from organisations working in the mental health and also in the sexual abuse and domestic violence sectors to solve some of the challenges that emerged from COVID-19. And today we'll be hearing from some fantastic speakers about their project, which was looking at how you can help and support staff and volunteers who are supporting others in an online space. So really, really key issue, really relevant issue that doesn't just apply to mental health support workers, but anybody really working remotely over this period. So I'd like to introduce to you Joshua McGovern and Miona Abassi Larson from Tectonic about the project that they conducted, how they approached the challenge, some of the things that they discovered and they learned, and the tool that they produced. So I'm going to hand it over to them now.
Amazing. Thank you, Helen. Okay, great. I am just going to share my screen. Thank you, everybody, for having Mio and I. Okay, perfect. Okay, great. So welcome, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining. Oh, let me set my timer. Perfect. Okay. So as Helen already said, we're here to talk about the Online Supportive Environments project, and really to look at design thinking in action, how we used it and how you could go on and use it yourselves. But to quickly just explain who we are as Tectonic, we're a hyper-targeted customer research firm for B2B companies and the charity sector. So we really enjoyed doing this project, so close to our hearts. So if I keep going on a little bit more, as Helen said, we were kind of set an overall project that we were working towards, but to dig into that a little bit deeper, the specific problem that we were working towards was how might we increase our understanding of the challenges that remote working poses to the well-being of staff and volunteers in mental health charities. So as Helen said, we've got that focus with the mental health charities, even though some of these remote working problems could be applicable to a wider area. And kind of further on from that, once we understand what those challenges might be, then how could we go on to develop solutions to help with those challenges? And when we look at that piece in a little bit more detail, it's exploring digital tools and ways of working that can be used to support staff working in stressful online environments. And again, that's applicable for all types of organizations, even though we were focusing on mental health and kind of carer charities predominantly. The environment and the support staff we were particularly looking at were people that were working with service users that were suffering crisis. So you might recognize those if you're kind of familiar with mental health charities or those kind of organizations. These can be people that are doing working directly with carers or people receiving care, befrienders and people in positions that deal directly with end service users. So it wasn't just Tectonic on the project. We have to shout out everybody else that made it possible. So we were working with a number of other organizations. As I said, mainly mental health, but one was kind of carer focused. We have TogetherCo, Samaritans, Peabody, Trustlinks, everyone, Children Northeast. The other charities is because we engaged a bunch of charities that weren't directly involved with the project, but we brought them in for further insight. And of course, Tectonic ourselves. So when we look at our approach, which we kind of covered the project over 11 weeks, there were kind of 6 steps or 6 stages, and we'll run through a number of those as we continue, but to just highlight them off the top, there was kind of the assumption and hypothesis setting, which we'll move into, looking at the user research in terms of how to kind of do interviews and kind of what came out of that with the findings. Okay, great, now we've got these understandings. How do we ideate and create ideas around that? Refining that concept, going into prototyping, where we'll talk about what actually is prototyping and how do you test it? And then some of the learnings that came out of the project and the next steps that we'll be moving forwards with. Perfect. So if we look at this first stage around assumptions, I don't know how familiar everybody is when we talk about assumptions in kind of a user research setting. But what we're talking about here is statements that you believe to be true based on your observations and personal intuition. So you definitely have experience that you might be onto something, but it might be outside of an environment where you've been able to test it or understand it in a controlled way. And without that kind of controlled understanding, it's difficult to kind of validate or invalidate whether those assumptions are correct. There are many ways to kind of go about looking at your assumptions and hypotheses and getting them out there. But a great tool to use is the Lean Canvas tool or Business Canvas tool, as you might have heard it otherwise described. And what it looks like, even though we've got a different example here just for Uber, what it looks like is a kind of single page that splits out a business or an organization into a number of different areas. And the key areas really for the assumptions you want to focus on is the problem areas, the solutions, the customer segments, and the early adopter. So that's kind of top left, top right. And basically by using this, you're able to just identify in different areas which problems you have, but also draw links and parallels between the two. So what we did with the other organizations in the cluster, we basically came together and we thought, okay, so who are the individuals, the staff and volunteers that are actually going to be the people that we want to speak to, people we want to do the user research with. So we had conversations around that. I'll go on and show you what kind of the profile we work towards. But then at the same time, we thought about, well, in this remote working environment, what are some of the problems that they might be dealing with if they are working with service users that are experiencing or suffering kind of extreme crisis? How is that affecting them, and how is that affecting their mental health as being a provider of that service? So we had this collaborative kind of discussion and working towards and around that. And what we move forwards to is a number of key assumptions here. And basically, to run through them, it was that the staff and volunteers were missing supportive check-ins. There was a greater emotional toll of remote work, increased screen overload as a result of working remotely. Some people were drifting into longer hours and struggling with new technologies, having to balance home life pressures and meeting the need of service users. So those were the assumptions that we thought, gosh, I think these things are really, having a negative effect on the mental health of the staff and volunteers of these types of organizations. So once we've got those assumptions set out, we know that throughout the user research and even down to the prototyping, we'll know what we're trying to test, what we're trying to validate or invalidate. Perfect. So once we've got that kind of grounding, we're able to move more into the user research stage that you might be more familiar with, which is kind of a profile and an interview and things like that. So again, collaboratively, we're working together to understand and build off that profile that I spoke about before. But what it basically worked out to be was mental health and care charities that were UK based. And we were trying initially, we thought, to speak to people that deliver services to the end users. You'll see as we went on, we spoke to people outside of that. No focus on gender or age, because we were looking at experiences that were universal to everybody that worked in those settings. And ideally had worked kind of pre, during and post lockdowns. So you had a spectrum of understanding, and they could reasonably compare what things were like before lockdown, now that it finished, and kind of during that period as well.
Maybe we should just mention what we mean by end users.
Absolutely. So when we talk about this project, is really focused on the staff and volunteers within the charities. So when we refer to end users, we mean the people that are actually benefiting from the charity's services. So in the befriender situation, that might be the people that are calling in or have a one-to-one relationship and are receiving that kind of either counsel or support. So great point, Mio, really to focus on that this is not for the end users themselves. This is for the people that are serving those end users. So maybe individuals such as yourselves within your own organizations. Perfect. So just to mean, I don't know how familiar everybody is with the concept of user interviews, but to speak briefly on it, there are kind of different ways to gather data from people when you're talking to them, and one of them is qualitative user interviews, which is asking more open-ended questions to get more nuanced data rather than kind of using stats and statistics that you might do from surveys. So we spoke to 27 staff and volunteers overall from a range of different charities. And as I mentioned before, we actually did speak to a wider range of people, both frontline, back office, kind of staff, anybody that was involved, because actually this issue of working remotely and kind of negative effects on mental health could be experienced by anybody in the organization. You needn't have to be working directly with a survey an end user, even though that might put you in a position where your mental health may be more affected because some of the situations that you're experiencing and the information that you're receiving. So once we kind of conducted these user interviews, we gathered those people together, the themes that were covered in the interviews that were related to those initial assumptions was understanding how their role worked and how that had kind of transferred into this remote time, the technology that they were utilizing, whether they were kind of working and still contacting and being supported by others as they had experienced earlier on when they were working in an office, where exactly was their mental health, and again, that peer-to-peer support element, and how was that materializing in this remote setting. So I won't go into all the actual questions, but those were the general areas that we were touching upon. We move into actually, okay, what came of those interviews and the findings that we had. So those initial assumptions there, to call those out, supportive check-ins, emotional toll, screen overload, longer hours, new tech, home life pressures, and meeting service needs. When we actually looked at kind of which of those were valid or invalidated, we found that, to be perfectly honest, they were all valid to an extent. They all had a somewhat detrimental effect, but remembering and linking back to our focus here, which was about supporting online environments, we recognized that some of the things that they were suffering from, so the emotional toll of remote work, there wasn't necessarily a natural fix that you could do because of an online environment. It was the nature of being online that increased the emotional toll. So we looked at particular areas that we thought that we could address in an online way or in a digital way. And those two areas were supportive check-ins and screen overloads. So it's saying here, volunteers got a lot of value out of the supportive check-ins that they had in person when they were in offices, because it was an informal part of that work culture and just helping them feel supported. When we look at the screen overload, well, not only were they doing everything remotely for their work, but that was extending to their home lives as well. So more and more use of the screens made it a little overwhelming and unbearable for certain individuals. So kind of pushing on from that, one of the other pieces of analysis that we did we didn't do anything around stats, but we wanted to still get some kind of quantitative data. So we use sentiment analysis, and to put it simply, there's basically assigning words to particular emotions. So as you see here, or emotions or feelings, so anger, anticipation, disgust, and so the list goes on. And basically we analyzed the words that came up in the interviews and the emotions and feelings that they related to. And it gave us a really interesting understanding of what's the subtext and the context behind just if somebody says, you know, actually how they're feeling, what were the words actually are being associated with. So a really easy example to look at is sadness. So pandemic was equating to, and I don't know if that would have equated to, you know, sadness 2 years ago. It might have just been a word, but the context and the state that we're in now meant that you were able to see that, oh, when they were talking about the pandemic, you know, they were feeling sad. When they were talking about having concerns or quiet or being honest or struggling, that was the emotion they were feeling there. On the flip side, when you talk about joy, you talk about kindness, volunteer, organization, charity, and that begins to let you know that the subtext behind that is that the community element there that they have around volunteers and the organizations and charity was something that was keeping them going and fulfilling them, you know, in this difficult time. So it's just a really interesting way to go another level down and understand kind of the meaning attached to words beyond just the words that they actually say. So we push on a little bit further. So remembering we've got those two opportunity areas. One is around supportive check-ins and one is around screen overload. So we go into what we call kind of an ideation design sprint, or it can have many different names. And when we talk about this, the purpose here is really probably more collaborative than any other part of the project. It's really putting your heads together and saying, okay, how can we just come up with as many different ideas as possible to explore how we could work on these different opportunity areas. And one of the ways in which we did that in this remote time is to use the tool called Miro. And the focus here is just much, as you can see there, it's a post-it note or kind of quantity over quality, even at this stage, kind of approach, where it's just, oh, I have an idea. Everything is allowed to be on the table. We're not ruling anything out here. And I think it's at this kind of level of free expression that you're able to see that the possibilities are completely open. And at this point, you really want to have that width and don't want to be ruling anything out. And that can be tricky because we often have our own leanings and bias when we think of a problem and go, I think that would be a great solution. But just giving room, you know, to experience and hear everything allows you to kind of those ideas to develop, because they might not have been what you were looking for at when they first happened, but as kind of people begin to add and build to them, you can kind of flesh that out. So the way we actually worked on this was we split out into different teams amongst the charities, and we used a concept called how might we's, and it's a very simple concept. It's just saying, asking you to think about a particular thing. So if we take supportive check-ins, it's how might we make supportive check-ins more available for staff and volunteers in remote times. And you just begin to, as I was talking about before, ideate around that. Anything is possible, just coming up and saying whatever you can and thinking about many different ways to kind of how you would actualize that. So we were doing that and we came up with these 7 core focuses of how might we's, because we felt in response to the supportive check-ins and the screen overload, amongst these 7, we might be able to move closer and closer to some kind of prototype or tool that would ultimately aid the staff and volunteers further down the line. I won't read out all of them now because they're a little bulky, but some of them is around how might we create an environment that most supports staff and volunteers for the supportive check-ins. Another one is about how might we help staff and volunteers prioritize supportive check-ins above other conflicting demands. How might we help them choose tools and support that's right for them when they're in that kind of difficult period. So all these different avenues, but all with the same focus of trying to make supportive check-ins more available or to reduce screen overload. So really spreading ourselves wide, knowing that once we've got those ideas, we'll be able to refine and circle down. So speaking of that, so I say we initially had 70 how might we's. That's how wide we're going, and we narrowed down to that 7. And then again in our groups independently, we're coming up with more and more ideas. And when I say that, this is very much a sort of, to put this into perspective for you, this is, okay, team, here's 5 minutes, here's 10 minutes. Try and write down as many as you can without limits, without thinking that'll never work. Nobody wants to hear that one, or somebody will say that already. Just being completely free and not worrying about that. And it's sometimes easier to do that in isolation if everybody does that, and then you bring those ideas to the table. So that's how we got 150 ideas, because everybody was just working in their own minds and then bringing that together. But when you brought it together, what was amazing is then that you see the similarities, or you get the benefit of somebody saying, oh, I never thought of it like that, but that's kind of like mine, but if we did your bit, and then these ideas begin to form and become stronger and better, and they begin to kind of gain momentum, and people begin to get behind them. So as I said, we come up with these 150 ideas, and we noticed that a lot of them have similarities. And in that, we whittled that down to what are the general features, or what are the general concepts that are being looked at here. And once we've done that, we move into these six final concepts that we kind of go, yeah, these are the central themes and the areas that we want to explore. We then kind of, everybody pitched as to why they thought that idea, we should kind of move forward with it, or why it was a viable option. And once that was done, everybody voted on which one we should go forwards with, until we got to one kind of basic idea for the prototype. Not fleshed out yet, but just a concept that we thought this has value to help either with the supportive check-ins or with the screen overload. In this particular example, it was with the supportive check-ins. So if we go forward, so we dubbed it Reflect. And the service here is an SMS service that sends an automatic message or prompt to a befriender or support worker, but again, that's available to everybody really, inquiring how they are feeling in that exact moment. So just a simple text message asking how they're doing at that time. And based on that response, Reflect the Reflect service will provide supportive suggestions to elevate their mood and improve their mental health. And the real focus around this was trying to interrupt people's days and interrupt people's thoughts, but in a positive way. How can we get them to consider their own feelings, particularly when they're working with people that could be dealing with difficult situations, and they're taking that on board and processing that themselves. So as you might remember, the title of this is Online Supportive Environments, and yet we managed to end up with texts, which might be seen online, but it's not really, it's a kind of an analog manual service. And what a really interesting point that came up when we were in that ideation stage was, and something that's come out of the COVID period in general, is people's lack of access to kind of either internet provision or to digital technology. And we thought, wouldn't it be an excellent thing to try and explore something that kind of takes that off the table? Obviously, still not everybody has a phone, but I think more people have that ability to receive the text than they might do, your WhatsApps and your things like that. So we thought, what an interesting way to come at it from that level and see if we can kind of unify people's experience and accessibility to the product. So we've got this basic concept, and we're like, okay, yeah, it sounds good, but how's it really going to work? So as we move into the next stage, where we look about actually refining this idea that we've come up with.
Yeah, sorry, just to interrupt. Another thing was also the whole try to reduce screen time, reduce the whole computer screen time. In that respect, it also really makes sense to try and send out text messages instead. So it's not constantly in front of your computer screen.
Absolutely. Sorry, as you can see, we've reached the gift portion of the deck. It will be over quickly if it's not your thing. But as I say, so we've got this concept, and now we're in this position of, okay, how are we going to make it a reality? And when we did this, we were thinking about a concept called MVPs, which you may be aware of, but if you're not, it's a term that's dubbed minimal viable product. Sometimes, or at least sometimes, we refer to it as minimum valuable product, because not everything that's viable is valuable. But we had all these things. We're like, oh yeah, Reflect can do this, Reflect can do that, and then we had to kind of really ground ourselves and think, what is it that it needs to do to be valuable? What is it that it needs to do, you know, to be useful and to be a solution that we could roll out to test? And I think that's a huge thing, is to not get too excited and thinking about what's the 10-year version, the 5-year version, the 2-year version. It's just like, what could we try out now that might see if this thing's got legs? So if you can see just on the screen, you know, the supportive suggestions and kind of manual text messages, we go, okay, cool, that's enough to test whether this thing has any value. When we look at future features, we're like, oh, okay, maybe the types of questions you can ask are more complex. Maybe the way in which it visually presents can be more appealing. Again, the types of scales and ways in which you can respond. Is there more automation in the process? So these were things we like, yeah, love it to do that, but let's just see if this has got legs first to start off with and test it and think about it simply. Which is kind of what I'm talking about here. I'm sorry, I absolutely love this GIF. And we were considering doing the automated version of Reflect straight away. Okay, let's link this up to an app of some kind, and it fires off a text here and it fires off a text there, and yay, we made a text thing. But as I said before, at this point, we don't even know if anybody cares, anybody will find this helpful, will relate to this. And we had to pull ourselves back and say, no, let's do it all manually. Let's take the human approach in providing this support before we even think about making it digital and kind of building upon it from kind of that piece. Nia, I saw you nodding. I didn't know if you wanted to add anything or if you were just nodding. Okay, great. So yeah, we decided to go with the human approach before automating anything. So knowing that, we actually look at, okay, I know what we want, features wise and all of that kind of thing. Let's actually make it a prototype. Let's actually test it. And before I even move on and start talking about what we did for the prototyping, I think it's just important to mention, because not everybody might be familiar with prototyping or may have an idea of it in their head. Prototyping can be anything from your grand end, which is the flashy apps, or kind of a click or walkthrough app, which just kind of shows screens. But at its simplest, it can just be a piece of paper that is describing a flow. And because at that level, you might be able to work out that, hey, this flow doesn't work. And thank goodness we didn't build the app and then find out the flow didn't work. So when we think about prototyping, it doesn't have to be digital. It doesn't have to be complex. It just needs to demonstrate either the value or the intended value of the tool or the product or whatever it is enough so that we can gain an understanding of if it's worth pursuing or what its kind of pitfalls are. So when we look at kind of our prototyping process, yay, we've come up with this great idea of, you know, let's provide supportive messages. And then it's like, oh, wait, well, we actually need to do that. We actually need to come up with things that are going to be supportive and might actually be beneficial for somebody to read in that day. So we spent time working on initial messages to send out as text that we felt, what is it that might elicit a good response to get somebody to say how they were feeling in that moment? How do you find that balance between this is a service and I know it might not be a person, but also like reaching them at a genuine level where they feel like you're really asking how they're doing and you have actual concern and interest in how they're doing. So we see here just a kind of a couple examples of how we initially approached that. So, you know, setting it up with, you know, how are you doing? Thank you for your time. And then saying, how stressful has your day been? As one example of to get an understanding of their mood and feeling. As we kind of move on from that, once they tell us how you're doing, you know, we have to provide a supportive suggestion or want to provide a supportive suggestion. And the way in which we've kind of approached this is, you know, depending on your state of mind or your state of being at that time, we're trying to assign or provide a suggestion that meets that level of need. So if you're kind of having a really tough time, some of the things you might need are less, you know, take a break, take a walk, or anything, or do an exercise. And it might be, you know, I need some, as the supportive check-in describes, I need some human contact. I need to talk to somebody. I need to vent. I need to express myself. So we had a range of different suggestions, you know, that covered covered an appropriate response depending on how you were doing at that time. Again, this is all prototyping. When we were writing them, all done with the knowledge that it could fall flat on its face, but what can we do enough that gets us in a position where we're able to test? So the testing that we actually did was more of a focus group type situation, where we had maybe like 5 to 6 people in the groups themselves, and then we were kind of testing out, reflect on them, and I'll show you what that looked like in just a sec. But what the themes that we were covering in those interviews, what we really wanted to get out and understand was the tone and the content of the suggestions working? Did the staff and volunteers think there would be a benefit to the nonprofit sector as a whole? What was the experience as a whole? What was being done well, and what could have been improved upon? So if we look here, this is kind of just like a simulated version of what that testing experience actually looked like. So Mio and I would be much like on a Zoom call like this, and we would be like, okay, look, we're gonna text you a message now, you know, that's asking you how you're doing, and if you could text back, I don't know if you can see there, if you text back there according to the scale. So do you want to talk to someone? Are you feeling stressed, nervous, or are you doing better? You know, you're sociable, or you're feeling calm. Depending on that response, we'll send over a supportive suggestion. We'll check back in to see whether you've done that suggestion. You tell us you have, and tell us whether it was beneficial for you or not. We kind of take that on board and note whether that supportive suggestion worked. And then we kind of say, all right, great, you know, we'll check in with you again in the following day, hoping to kind of provide, again, a more appropriate suggestion based on the feedback that we were given. Actually, I'll say here as well, we did also do another trial, which is kind of a 3-day trial, where outside of the simulated event, people for 3 days actually did receive these text messages, and we were able to get that further data from them. And then we asked them to do, it's called like a love letter, breakup letter, where you basically, depending on your feelings towards the service or reflect, you are asked to write a love letter to describe why you loved it, or you're asked to describe, asked to write a breakup letter as to why you were canceling this subscription, if it was a subscription-based product. So those are some of the way that we got our feedback in. And when we did that, we found that there are a number of areas that needed to be further refined. One of which was the tone and the efficacy of the actual suggestions. So although our intention, you know, was coming in from a good place, they said, you know, some messages hit the mark, and some people felt that others were a bit cold or a bit robotic, or the suggestion kind of just didn't work for them at that time. Another thing they were interested about was the timing of the messages. I don't know if I want to receive a message at the same time every day. Maybe I'm working different hours, or I don't know if I want to have my check-in at 1 p.m. or 2 p.m. Actually, maybe at the end of the day, when I've been able to decompress, I'll be able to have a better understanding of how I'm doing now that it's all over, rather than in the middle of it. People did talk about kind of the automated and personal messaging, whether particular messages within the kind of flow and the service were more appropriate to be automated. But also with those automated messages, sometimes people felt like they might not have been heard, depending on what their responses were. If they gave a more expressive response than just, yes, that was helpful, if they got a text message back that said, okay, thanks, it's kind of, they feel like, well, I've lent into this process and I've given you my feelings, and I don't feel like that's been reciprocated. So we've taken that on board. We wanted to measure the value of the service kind of more accurately. And a really big one was, what happens if you interact with somebody and they're actually, you know, having a really, really difficult time, and it's beyond the levels of doing exercise, and they might need to speak to somebody more urgently, potentially, you know, with more seniority and more experience and guidance than just a colleague or a manager. And we were looking at, where does the service end, and where do kind of those processes come into play. I'll talk about a little bit more about how that has kind of continued to play out in just a second. But this was the bulk. This is up to now kind of at our 11-week, 10-week period. And we're looking at what kind of the initial learnings from the project, and what kind of the next steps we could take would be. So at the end of the project, we ran a survey with all the organizations that were involved, and we asked a bunch of different questions, but one of which was, what were the key learnings that the charities were able to take away from the project? And that wasn't limited to about the prototype, it was the whole project as a whole. And the kind of top answers that came back were this point around many charities facing the same challenges. It was something that they thought, or they kind of suspected, but it was really eye-opening and really affirming to know that other people were dealing with the same challenges, and that wasn't a reflection on their own organization, but rather the experience of the sector. And kind of tapped into that, working collaboratively and leaning on other people's experiences, you know, really and engaging in that, helping them, particularly in that ideation kind of stage, helping us to kind of work more effectively and get to kind of spaces and ideas that we wouldn't have got to in isolation, either because, you know, we wouldn't consider it, or just because kind of we didn't think of it at the time. So they really kind of benefited from that that collaborative element. Staff and volunteers obviously have a great need for supportive check-ins. It was a huge thing that came out of the user research itself. And then a really great one around kind of prototyping and ideating, that it doesn't have to be a long drawn out process, and it doesn't have to be complex to be effective. We were able to, you know, run these sessions, do those testing sessions, one of which it was an hour for each session, the other was 3 days, and you got the data back to understand whether this is something, you know, you should explore further. Where we are kind of today, it's progressed since the 11 weeks, because we've actually kind of continued a bit. But now we're working with staff and volunteers and mental health professionals to refine the Reflect service. That's really about those areas that we touched on before. And some of that work, particularly with the mental health professional, is what's the kind of language that would be most appropriate to use to not only get the best responses out of people, but to help them feel comfortable and cared for. Mio literally at the moment is running daily trials with people on this additional kind of version or further version of Reflect, and kind of we'll be gathering that data as time goes on, and then also kind of exploring kind of the automation in the service. At the moment, we're still doing it completely manually, as per, you know, looking at the data and seeing what's appropriate. But we are kind of seeing that automation piece being on the horizon, and just exploring what that would look like and what would be best, and how to do that. So I think we're now open to questions. I know looking at my own timer, I've gone past where I wanted to go, but hopefully we'll be able to get in a bit more. And if anybody has more questions for me, I'm able to stick around a little longer if that works. So thank you very much. Perfect. Okay.
Yeah, I think a good takeaway was also that what actually came back initially from the first testing was that the staff and volunteers really appreciated just getting a message that kind of made them stop and consider themselves, even if the rest wasn't like something that really made them feel better. It was just nice to get a little, oh, just stop for a moment and consider, how are you? Check in with yourself.
I thought that was,
absolutely.
Sorry,
please go ahead.
I thought that was really interesting. So in terms of the service and the next steps, be interesting to hear, like, what are your plans for that? Is it going to be a commercial product that's going to be available to charities and nonprofits? And then also I'm interested to know if during the course of your research you found that you know, that staff and volunteers may be in a place of stress, but not necessarily caused by the workload or anything to do with that, but actually their personal problems and what else they've got on, like issues at home, their relationships, their own finances. Yeah, be interested to hear about that.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that last one. Firstly, absolutely. The combination of being at home more, juggling whatever responsibilities they would have had in play before kind of COVID and lockdown, definitely played a part. There are some kind of more obvious examples, which are kind of things like kind of care for children and kind of schooling and stuff like that, which we can expect, but also other things where that blur between the problems that people, or not even problems, but the environments, the situations that people had kept private in their home lives now could no longer be kept quite so detached. And you know, a simple way to do that is, if you were a befriender, now the people that you were working with, the end service users, you know, right there in your living room. And that might, and you might not be in a position where you're comfortable about your living environment being seen by other people. So that blurring of the lines definitely brought in kind of people's home environments, home relationships, with the complications that remote working kind of developed as well. In terms of the Reflect service as a whole, so I mean, where it's at today is anybody could adopt and trial it. So we have a trial guide document which would give you all the supportive suggestions, all of the check-in messages to send, how to run it, and everything like that. So in its manual state, available to everybody on request. In terms of kind of further development, what we're looking at, because kind of the way in which the project is kind of set up, there's a little bit of blur about kind of when it comes to an end and kind of who continues it. One thing that we want to do so that charities could make best use of the work that we've done is leave the project with an understanding of how much it might cost to actually build an automated version, so that understanding could be given to the charities, and they could then make decisions as to whether, if it was, if it worked for them financially, or if it had the benefits to kind of warrant that kind of cost. So we're working still towards that at the moment.